They made me wear this, so rich men could hunt me." Salder lowered his rifle and turned on his own. The private forest was too perfect a manicured wilderness that choked on its own unnatural order. Every tree stood like a silent soldier, the air thick with silent dread and a concealed brutality. Weston Cade moved through it like a ghost, his Winchester held low. This was his trade tracking. But this hunt felt wrong. The tracks were too small, the trail too easy, almost a greenhorn's path laid out for him. He was a wolf on a leash, and he was beginning to hate the feel of the collar. He pushed the thought aside, along with the ghost of a little girl's laughter that haunted his quiet moments. He cornered his quarry in a thicket of buckthorn, a small shape in buckskin. He raised his rifle, the cold metal familiar against his cheek. Just another target. Then the figure turned. It was a boy no older than 10, his face smeared with crude paint, his eyes wide with a terror that ripped through Cade's soul. The boy threw up his hands, a sob catching in his throat. "Don't shoot," he cried. "They made me wear this. They have my sister. They said she's next." In that instant, Cade understood the horrifying truth. This wasn't a hunt. It was a performance, and he had just been cast as the executioner. But who was the director of this monstrous play? The boy's words hung in the air, a verdict that condemned the world. For a full second, Weston Cade was frozen, not by fear, but by a cold seismic shock that cracked the foundations of his soul. The man who had faced down charging warriors and stared into the barrels of 100 rifles was now undone by the terrified whisper of a child. His military training took over a ghost inhabiting his limbs. He lunged not at the boy, but for him. One arm scooped Micah from the ground, the other hand clamping over his mouth to stifle any further sound. Quiet Cade hissed the single word, a blade, cutting through the unnatural silence. He moved backward, melting into the deep shadows of the forest, every sense screaming. He was no longer the hunter. He was the protector of a secret, and the forest, once a mere hunting ground, had transformed into a cage of silent watching eyes. He found them a sanctuary of sorts, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of tangled ivy, its mouth masked by a cluster of ancient moss-covered boulders. It was damp and smelled of wet earth, a primal smell that was a welcome relief from the perfumed brutality of Boone's estate. He set the boy down gently. Micah was trembling a leaf in a storm, his wide eyes fixed on Cade's grim face. Are they coming for us?" the boy stammered. "They're coming for me." Cade said the lie a necessary armor. You just got in the way. He needed the distance. He needed to think of this as a tactical problem, not a rescue. To think of it any other way was to invite the ghosts in, but the ghosts were already there. He took a canteen and a strip of cloth from his saddle roll and began to gently wipe the crude paint from Micah's face. Red and black smears came away, revealing the pale, tear-streaked skin of a child. The boy had high cheekbones, a dusting of freckles across his nose, and as Cade cleaned a smudge from his temple, his hand froze. The touch was too familiar. He was thrown back in time, not to a battlefield, but to a quiet evening by a hearth. He remembered the impossible weight of a much smaller hand in his, the scent of lavender soap on clean skin, the sound of a little girl's laugh as he wiped a smudge of jam from her face. Sarah. The name was a scar on his heart, and he shoved the memory down into the dark place where he kept all the things that could still hurt him. He forced his voice to be level, a commander's voice. "Tell me everything, son." "Who is he, Mr. Boone?" Micah whispered. "He owns everything. The woods, the big house, us. He and his friends, they come every year for the festival. The great frontier hunt, they call it." The boy shivered. "They said it was a game, and your sister Ruth Cade's voice was tight. She's in the house. Mr. Boone keeps her in a room in the cellar. She's for the final hunt, at sunrise." Micah's face crumpled. "They gave her a white dress. Mr. Boone," he smiled. "He said the little doe should look pure for the final chase. The image a 7-year-old girl in a white dress being hunted for sport sent a wave of pure black rage through Cade. It was a rage so cold and clean, it felt like sanity. The name Gareth Boone now solidified from a client into a monster. Cade knew the name by reputation, a man of immense wealth, a king in this territory, a man whose power made him untouchable. To go against him was to go against the very structure of this world. It was hopeless. It was necessary. He looked at Micah, who had crept closer to the small, smokeless fire Cade had managed to build. In the boy's silhouette he saw the ghost of his daughter. He finally understood. The enemies he had fought in his blue uniform were just men following orders just as he had. They had names, families, reasons. This was different. This was an evil that wore a tuxedo and a smile. This was the real heart of savagery. "What's your name?" Mr. Micah's quiet voice broke the silence. Cade hesitated for a long time. A name was a connection, a bond he couldn't afford. But looking at the boy, he knew he had already crossed that line. "Cade," he said, the name feeling foreign on his own tongue. "Weston Cade, I'm Micah." A pause. "Mr. Cade, are you going to save her?" The directness of it was a physical blow. It was the question of a child who still believed that saving was something men did. It demanded an answer, a commitment. It demanded that Weston Cade, the man who had lost everything, finally choose a side. He looked past the fire, out of the cave's mouth, toward the distant arrogant lights of Boone's manor. His despair burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard certainty of a soldier with a new war to fight. "They have rules for this game of theirs, right?" Micah Cade asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The boy nodded, confused. A grim, humorless smile touched Cade's lips for the first time. "Good," he said. "Tonight we're going to teach them how to lose." The plan was born of desperation and forged in cold fury. In the flickering firelight of the cave, Cade laid it out for Micah, his voice a low, steady whisper that defied the tremor in his own hands. He spoke not of monsters or masked balls, but of tactics. "The big house will be full tonight," he said, pointing a finger toward the distant pinpricks of light. "A party. That means noise music and distracted men. It's the best cover we're going to get." Micah's eyes were wide, 2 dark pools of fear. "But they have guards, Mr. Cade. I saw them. They walk the walls with rifles. Guards at a party get lazy." Cade countered the lie, meant more to soothe than to be believed. "And I'm better in the dark than they are in the daylight." He placed a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. The contact was brief, almost reluctant, yet it carried the weight of a promise. "I need a sentry. I need you to stay here hidden. You keep watch on that path. You'll be my eyes from the outside. Can you do that, soldier?" The boy, given a mission, a purpose, puffed out his chest just a little. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. "I won't leave this mountain without her." Cade said the words, a blood oath, sworn to the boy, to the ghost of his daughter, and to himself. "I will come back, with Ruth." He moved through the night like a wraith, a shade darker than the shadows he employed. The forest, so perfectly arranged by day, became a labyrinth of lurking threats by night. The manicured lawns were killing fields, the ornate hedges potential ambushes. The faint, elegant strains of a waltz drifted on the wind, a sickeningly sweet sound that grated on his nerves. He could smell the champagne and cigar smoke, the perfume of the women, the scent of rot. He moved with the patience of a wolf, observing the patrol patterns, the lazy cadence of the guards as the night wore on. He found his opportunity in the form of a young aristocrat who had stumbled into the gardens to relieve himself of too much drink, his fine suit a stark silhouette against the moonlight. Cade was on him in a flash, a hand over the man's mouth, the hard barrel of his pistol pressed to the temple. There was no struggle, just a choked gasp and the quiet slump of a body. Cade didn't kill him. He was not them. He stripped the man of his tailcoat, his trousers, and most importantly his mask. It was a gilded, sneering wolf. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. To hunt the true wolves, he had to become one. Entering the ballroom was like stepping into a dream from a madhouse. A galaxy of chandeliers threw shimmering, fractured light onto a swirling sea of silk and velvet. Diamonds glittered on pale throats, and the air was thick with a sweet, cloying warmth. An orchestra played their music, a silken veil draped over something ugly. Cade, hidden behind the wolf mask, stood at the edge of the room, a ghost at the feast. He saw them not as men and women, but as a pack. Their laughter was the yip of coyotes over a fresh kill. Their polite, cultured conversation was the hiss of snakes in the grass. He drifted through the crowd, his rage a tightly coiled spring in his chest. Gareth's festivals are always so thrilling, a woman with jewels in her hair whispered to her companion. The authenticity is what makes it, don't you think? It feels so primal. Further on, a portly man with a politician's smile boasted to a friend, "My quarry last year was a real spitfire, had the spirit of a true savage. Gave me a proper chase before the end." Cade's hand tightened around the butt of his Colt. It would be so easy. A few seconds of gunfire and this den of vipers would be silenced forever. But his mission wasn't vengeance, not yet. It was rescue. His eyes found Gareth Boone. He stood by the great fireplace, the lord of this grotesque manor, his arm around a woman in a crimson dress. He was laughing, his face flushed with wine and victory. He raised his glass, tapping it for attention. The music subsided. My friend's Boone's voice boomed rich and confident. A toast. To the traditions that forged us, to the spirit of the hunt, and to the purity and promise of the final chase at dawn. A roar of approval went through the room. They were toasting to the terror of a 7-year-old girl. The toast gave Cade his direction. Dawn. The timeline was brutally short. He slipped from the ballroom's dazzling light back into the muted, shadowy world of the service corridors. The house was a beast, and he was moving deeper into its belly. The air grew colder as he found a narrow staircase spiraling down into the darkness. He descended, his steps silent. From the blackness below he heard it. It wasn't a cry, it wasn't a sob. It was a sound far more heartbreaking, a small, quiet, off-key humming. A little girl alone in the dark, humming a nursery rhyme to herself to keep the monsters at bay. He knew he had found her, but the corridor was long and bare, and he could see the silhouette of a guard pacing at the far end, his rifle resting on his shoulder. The monster was at the door. How in God's name was he going to get past him? The cold stone of the corridor seemed to leach the warmth from Cade's very bones. Below, at the bottom of the spiraling staircase, a single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating a heavy oak door and the man who stood before it, the guard. He paced a short, repetitive route, a caged animal guarding a smaller, more precious captive. His shadow, long and distorted, danced on the walls like a specter of death. And through it all a sound, a quiet, off-key humming, a child's nursery rhyme, a fragile thread of defiance woven into the suffocating fabric of dread. Ruth. She was humming to herself in the dark, a sound so heartbreakingly brave it made Cade's teeth ache. He was a soldier. His life had been a series of direct, violent solutions to complex problems. But here violence was a blunt instrument that would only lead to failure. He needed to be a ghost. He watched the guards patrol, searching for a pattern, a moment of weakness, a single second of inattention. But the man was disciplined. The path was closed. Retreating back into the silent servants' corridor, Cade moved like a phantom. He needed another way. Another path into the beast's belly. A door slightly ajar caught his eye. He slipped inside. He had found the monster's mind. The room was the antithesis of the cold cellar below. It was a space of obscene comfort, paneled in rich mahogany, and smelling of old leather brandy and the self-satisfied smoke of a fine cigar. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, deceptive glow. This was Gareth Boone's private study, and it was a gallery of horrors. On the walls, among the mounted heads of magnificent stags and the snarling visage of a great bear, was a smaller glass-fronted display case. Cade stepped closer. His blood ran cold. Inside, arranged on a bed of black velvet, were not animal trophies. There was a child's worn leather shoe, a small hand-carved toy soldier, and a single faded pink ribbon, trophies from previous hunts, souvenirs of murdered innocence. On the massive oak desk, a leather-bound journal lay open. Cade's eyes scanned the elegant spidery script, his breath catching in his throat. Boone wrote not of sport, but of philosophy. The weakness of modern man is compassion, one line read. It is a cancer of the soul. We must embrace the role of the predator to remind the world of nature's true, brutal order. We must shape the herd. A chill more profound than any mountain wind swept through Cade. He was not dealing with a sadist. He was dealing with a prophet of a twisted evil faith. His eyes caught another entry, a fresh one. The girl is special. She has her mother's fire. She will make for a worthy final test before we introduce the labyrinth next season, the labyrinth. The name meant nothing to Cade, but it carried the weight of some new, unimagined horror. This was not a one-time event. It was a tradition, an evolving institution of evil. He had to get her out, now. He found it in a small alcove off the main corridor, a dumbwaiter, a relic from a bygone era, used to transport meals from the kitchens below. The ropes were thick with dust, but they felt strong. It was a straight, dark path to the cellars, a way to bypass the guard. A grave-like shaft he would have to entrust with his life. The descent was a claustrophobic, suffocating journey in absolute blackness. Dust rained down on him, the musty smell of rot filling his lungs. He moved by, feel his hands and boots bracing against the narrow walls, the thick rope groaning under his weight. He emerged into a small cold pantry, the air thick with the scent of root vegetables and damp stone. He was below. Through a small barred window in the pantry door he could see into the main wine cellar, and he could see the heavy wooden door to Ruth's cell. It was barred from the outside with a heavy iron beam. He crept to the door, pressing his face against the rough wood. He could feel the terrified silence on the other side. The humming had stopped. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice barely a sound. A tiny gasp from within. "Who's there?" The voice was a frightened squeak. "A friend of your brother's," Cade said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Micah sent me. I'm here to take you home. They told me I have to play a game," she whispered back. "At sunrise." "The game is canceled," Cade promised. "But you have to be quiet now. Quieter than a mouse in a church. Can you do that for me?" He heard a small, shaky affirmation from inside. He put his hands on the heavy iron bar, testing its weight. It was solid, immovable, without making a sound that would bring the entire house down on them. As he strategized, he heard them. Footsteps, approaching down the main corridor, heavy, deliberate. He ducked back into the deepest shadows of the pantry, just as the guard appeared, stopping directly in front of Ruth's cell. The man jiggled the lock on the door, a gesture of casual dominance, then leaned his rifle against the wall. He pulled out a cigarette, struck a match against the stone, and the brief flare illuminated his bored, cruel face. He wasn't leaving, he was taking a break, right there. Cade was trapped. A wall of stone, a door of oak, and an armed man separated him from the child he'd sworn to save. He closed his eyes, the scent of the guard's tobacco smoke, an acrid violation in the cold air. The ghost of his daughter Sarah appeared in the darkness behind his lids. He remembered a promise he had made her a lifetime ago, to always, always keep the monsters away. A promise he had failed to keep. He opened his eyes. The failure would not happen again. His gaze fell upon the thick dumbwaiter rope, hanging in the shaft, then to the shelves in the pantry laden with heavy clay jars of preserved goods. Silence was no longer an option. A new plan, a desperate and violent one, began to form. If he couldn't be a ghost, he would have to become a storm. Silence was a weapon Cade could no longer afford. The guard stood between him and the girl, a lazy, implacable obstacle. To fight him was to bring the whole house down upon them. To wait was to let the sun rise on a new horror. He had to create a different kind of violence, a louder one. He worked with a ghost's quiet precision in the shadows of the pantry. He found a half-empty bottle of kerosene for the kitchen lamps and a box of matches. He unspooled the thick, greasy rope from the dumbwaiter, tying one end securely around the base of a heavy shelving unit, laden with clay jars of spices and preserved fruits. He ran the other end up through the dark shaft, a crude but powerful pulley. He was not just planning to open a door, he was planning to break the silence of the house itself. He took a length of twine, soaked it in kerosene to create a slow-burning fuse, and attached it to a small bundle of oily rags. This he sent up the shaft on a separate thinner line, a venomous snake climbing into the floors above. He didn't know exactly what was up there. He didn't care. He just needed a fire. He needed chaos. He crept back to the cellar door, his lips close to the wood. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice a low vibration. "You're going to hear a loud noise, a very loud noise. When you do, I want you to crawl under the cot in your room and cover your head. Don't come out until you hear my voice call your name." "Do you understand?" A tiny trembling. "Yes," came from the other side. That was all he needed. He struck a match. The small flame trembled in his hand. He touched it to the fuse. The fire caught a small, hungry orange bud that began its slow, inexorable climb into the darkness above. Then he waited. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each tick of his own heart a hammer blow. The first sign was a smell, a faint, acrid scent of smoke snaking down the staircase. The guard in the corridor sniffed the air, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then came the shouts from upstairs. Distant at first, then closer, more frantic. The alarm bell began to clang, a frantic brazen sound that shattered the waltz and the laughter. The guard, torn between his post and the escalating panic, took 2 steps up the stairs, then hesitated. That was Cade's moment. He threw his entire weight onto the dumbwaiter rope. The great shelving unit in the pantry groaned, tilted, and then crashed to the stone floor with a sound like a clap of thunder. Jars shattered, sending a cascade of spices and sticky preserves across the flagstones. The noise was apocalyptic. The guard, startled by the crash below, and the fire alarm above, made his choice. He abandoned his post and sprinted up the stairs toward the chaos. Cade didn't waste a fraction of a second. He grabbed a loose foundation stone and used it as a battering ram, smashing the heavy iron bar from its brackets. The cellar door flew open. Ruth was huddled in the corner, a small, pale shape in a simple white shift. He scooped her into his arms. "Got you," he breathed. Their escape was a frantic scramble through a house at war with itself. Guests in fine clothes and grotesque masks ran screaming through the hallways. Servants carrying buckets of water collided with them. A guest with a painted devil's face saw them, his eyes widening. "It's the girl," he shrieked. And a man in a wolf mask stopped them. The hunt was on. Cade, holding Ruth's small hand in his iron grip, plunged deeper into the manor's labyrinthine underbelly. He led them through steam-filled laundry rooms, down dark storage corridors that smelled of dust and secrets, and finally burst through a side door into the cool, clean night. They were free of the house, but they were exposed in the moonlit gardens. Lanterns bobbed across the lawns like angry fireflies. The baying of hounds echoed from the kennels. Shouts converged on them from all sides. This way Cade commanded, pulling Ruth toward the dark line of the forest. He ran with a burning in his side and a fire in his soul, the small, trusting hand in his, the only thing that mattered. He used every trick he knew, doubling back, using a shallow stream to mask their scent, moving through the thickest, most tangled parts of the woods where horses couldn't follow. Hours later, breathless and bleeding, they reached the cave. Micah was there, a frantic sentinel at the entrance. He had seen the fire from afar, a terrible orange glow against the night sky. When he saw Cade emerge from the darkness with Ruth, his face crumpled with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. The 2 children collided, a desperate, tearful reunion in the mouth of the cave. They didn't speak. They just held on to each other, 2 halves of a whole, made one again. Cade watched them, his back against the cold stone, the silent, bleeding guardian. For one brief, shining moment, he felt a flicker of something that might have been peace. He had kept his promise. He had brought her back. But the moment was fleeting. The victory an illusion. As he looked out from the cave, he saw the forest coming alive. A web of lanterns was moving through the trees, methodical, organized, closing in. The baying of the hounds was no longer a distant echo. It was close, and getting closer. He had pulled 2 children from the wolf's den, only to find himself trapped in a mountain cave with the entire pack baying at the door. The sun would be up in a few hours, and with it the final hunt would begin. The only question left was who now was the hunter, and who was the prey. The hunt began at dawn. A sliver of pale gray light cut through the trees, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the mouth of the cave. Inside, the world was small and quiet. Cade checked the last of his ammunition. 6 rounds for the Colt, 10 for the Winchester. Not a war chest, but a prayer. Across the small dying fire, the 2 children slept, huddled together under a single blanket, their small chests rising and falling in a rhythm of innocent trust. That trust was a heavier weight than any sin Cade had ever carried. He was a soldier again, the familiar cold calm settling over him. But this was a war he had chosen. His cause was not a flag, but the sound of 2 children breathing in the dark. He looked at the crude map of the forest he had sketched in the dirt floor. He was not planning an escape, he was planning an engagement. He slipped from the cave before the sun had crested the ridge a ghost in the pre-dawn mist. This forest was Boone's property, but it was Cade's element. He moved through the trees, not as a trespasser, but as a rightful older authority. He was the land's own retribution. The hunters came, as he knew they would, loud, arrogant, and clumsy. A pack of city men playing at being wolves, led by a true one. Cade watched them from a high granite outcropping as they followed a false trail. He had laid a trail that led them into a narrow, dead-end ravine. He did not fire a shot. He used a single bullet for a different purpose. The report of his Winchester echoed through the canyon sharp and clean, and the bullet severed a thick rope he had found tied to a precariously balanced deadfall. The sound of 1,000 tons of rock and timber crashing down into the ravine was the sound of Boone's hunt shattering into chaos. Horses screamed and bolted. Men shouted in panic and confusion, their party scattered, their confidence broken. They were no longer hunters. They were just lost, frightened men. He moved through the forest like a whisper, a force of nature. He took them down in pairs and singles, not with killing shots, but with a brutal, disabling efficiency. A swift blow from the butt of his rifle, a length of rope, a silent takedown from the shadows. He left them tied to the trees they had claimed as their sporting ground, disarmed and humiliated. He was dismantling Boone's world piece by piece, leaving the king isolated in his own empty kingdom. He let Boone find him. He led him to a small, ancient clearing dominated by a single massive oak that had stood for centuries. It felt like an arena, a place for a final judgment. Boone crashed through the undergrowth, his fine hunting coat torn, his face purple with rage. "You," he roared, raising his rifle. "You think you can defy me in my own home, soldier. This isn't your home, Boone." Cade's voice was low, devoid of heat. It was colder. "You just put a fence around it. A place like this, it belongs to something older than your money." "I gave those children a gift," Boone screamed, his eyes wild. "A glorious death, a purpose better than rotting in some gutter. You gave them terror." Cade said, stepping from behind the oak, his own rifle held steady. "You used them to make yourself feel powerful because you are the weakest man I have ever known." The fight was not a noble duel. It was a desperate, ugly thing. Boone fought with the entitled fury of a man who had never been denied anything. Cade fought with the grim, weary purpose of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. It was a clash of bone and will under the silent judgment of the ancient oak. It ended with Boone on his knees, disarmed, his face a mask of disbelief. Cade stood over him, the barrel of his Winchester steady. The old Cade, the soldier, would have pulled the trigger. an execution, an end. But he looked past the pathetic, defeated man through the trees, toward the distant promise of the cave. He saw two small faces. He saw a future. Killing Boone would be an act of rage. Justice had to be something more. He returned to the cave as the morning sun streamed through the canopy, bathing the forest floor in a clean golden light. He woke the children gently. They did not ask what happened. They saw the answer in the quiet calm of his eyes. He took them by the hand, one for each of his own, and led them out of the darkness. He did not know where they were going, what town they would find, or what life awaited them. He only knew that they would face it together. As they walked, the ghost of his daughter, the one who had haunted every quiet moment of his life for so long, was finally mercifully silent. He had lost his own war in another time, in another place. But today, under the watchful eyes of the forest, he had finally won someone else's.